Chapter 7, looking at digital media in Italy. But Italy is a very specific place in contrast to many of the countries we've been looking at. As we can see, history in Italy, especially since World War II, people haven't been very political. And perhaps that can help explain why Italy has seen over 60 different governments since World War II. Now, what does that mean? 60 different governments means it has a parliamentary system, and once parliament is elected, they have trouble forming and keeping coalition governments. The governments fall apart, usually within 2 years, sometimes even less. So why is it exactly that things in Italy seem so politically unstable? Perhaps it has to do with the legacy of World War II. Perhaps it has to do with its geographic location and its diverse population in comparison to a lot of other places in Europe. But what we're going to see here and look at particularly is, can the internet, digital media, online engagement take place and replace traditional media in Italy and increase political engagement? So that's what we're concerned about here. Instead of looking at each model independently here, I want to take this time to look at all four together. And then now we're really going to start to get into more methods and more potential issues with statistics. And this really leads up into next chapter as well. But overall, what did our authors find? Using internet use as their independent variable, they found that using the internet will increase the likelihood of visiting a website of a candidate or party member. It will increase a person's probability of signing an online petition. It'll increase a person's probability of participating in an offline event if they receive an online invitation. And it increases their probability of expressing political viewpoints online. So in total, what we find here, or at least the authors find, is that the internet is increasing engagement even in offline events by receiving an online invitation. So the idea is that non-traditional participants, internet users, younger people, can and are starting to be more engaged because of the internet. Think about it, the digital divide. They're using the internet to increase participation. So they're getting rid of the digital divide. So this is good, and we're going to talk about more of the implications in a moment. But what I want to focus on now is some specific questions. One is multicollinearity, which we've talked about, but the second one is something called endogeneity. Endogeneity is whenever your independent variable and your dependent variable are measuring similar things, and you cannot necessarily tell if it's your independent variable that's affecting your dependent variable, or if it's your dependent variable that actually affects your independent variable. So that's endogeneity. Your two variables cross over. Well, what happens if this is the case? Your models are biased, and your results are questionable at best. So why would I think about this in this specific instance? Well, first off, your independent variable is increasing internet use. And one of the dependent variables for the models in particular, I find quite troublesome in this regard. And that's going to an offline event after you receive an online invitation. By the very nature of that variable, you have to have internet before you can receive an online invitation. See, these two variables are probably connected. They're probably measuring similar things, and in fact, you could probably switch places with them and say, receiving an online invitation and going to an offline event might even lead to having increased internet access, which theoretically that does not make sense. That's the problem whenever you have endogeneity in a model. So for that specific model, I don't think I would actually take those results. The other models, though, we're going to take those at face value, and we'll keep going and see some of these other implications that we can draw from Italy and from internet use increasing participation in non-traditional participants. All right, so what are some of our implications from this? If we take for granted that internet use really is increasing participation in non-traditional participants in Italy, something else we find is that those participants are consuming news more online. They're completely ignoring traditional media, which they weren't participating in to begin with. But the implications with that is, for Italy, traditional media hasn't been, and likely will not be in the future, as important as it is in other European countries. And the authors even bring out the idea about the polarized pluralist model. They say perhaps Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, perhaps this is happening in all of these places. And now what does that mean though? It means that internet use and digital media are replacing traditional media at a faster rate than in other European countries that are perhaps your democratic corporatist countries. Remember, democratic corporatists, they have higher newspaper circulation rates. TV consumption rates are high. People consume traditional media more in comparison to polarized pluralist countries. So that means in countries where traditional media are stronger, digital media are taking longer to replace traditional media. But in polarized pluralist countries, like in Spain, online, internet use, digital media, it's replacing traditional media at a much faster rate. The implications are pretty big if you think about it globally. Where traditional media in most countries never was that strong, it means online news consumption will be replacing traditional media at an even faster rate. Of course, that is taking one thing for granted: internet domestication rates. But once internet domestication rates are higher in those different countries, then we should expect, very similar to this case in Italy, that traditional media will play an even less role in informing people about politics and engaging people in politics. But we're going to think about this a little bit more going further, and what does it really mean for democracy in Italy? So here we have some possible conclusions about digital media becoming more important. And one of the big things is that as internet use increases, we are going to see new participants in our democratic countries. As internet use increases, the agenda-setting power of traditional media decreases. So theoretically, you could end up with a more pluralistic view of what's happening, meaning you could see an increase in the truth, perspective, and many different perspectives. So put these together. You decrease the agenda-setting power, so perhaps you're increasing truth and reliability of your information. You're increasing new political participants in your country. Put both of those things together, and you have the potential for an increase in the quality of your democracy. Brought to you via the internet. Well, that sounds wonderful, right? But what do you think? Is this wishful thinking? Is this happening today? Is internet use engaging new participants? Is internet use decreasing the agenda-setting power of traditional media? And has the internet, with these two things, increased the quality of democracy in Italy, in Europe, in the US, in all places where internet is becoming the next thing, or rather, the current thing? I look forward to hear what you have to say about this in the forums.